Okay, yeah. Okay, could everybody take their seats, please? And we can get this thing started. I guess everybody's... Okay. Just good evening, everyone. Glad you could make it here. As chair of the MBTA Communities Multifamily Housing Advisory Committee, I want to welcome you to the public forum and thank you for being here. Our public forum tonight is one more step in a lengthy process for the town to comply with public law requiring MBTA and MBTA adjacent communities to provide zoning that will permit the development of multifamily housing by right in at least one district in the town. For Westford, as an adjacent MBTA community, it means zoning for a minimum of 924 potential units on a minimum of 50 acres with a minimum density of 15 units per acre and with a maximum of 10% affordable units. We must have an approved plan by December the 31st of 2024 to be compliant. And there are some potential sanctions for non-compliance, as you probably read in the newspaper. The town has been working on this since January of 2022, when the Land Use Management Department has started complying by sending in required reports that would keep us compliant or interim compliance until we really get down to establish the zones. The public notice kind of began with the 2022 strategic retreat, where participants were asked to indicate where they would prefer multifamily housing to be located. The town submitted an action plan to the state in December 2022, which was accepted, and it was designed to gain interim compliance. In June of this year, the town manager appointed 9 members and 3 alternates of the MBTA committee. Meetings began in July. Also in June, the town, using a housing choice grant of $75,000, contracted with Dodson and Flinker, a well-regarded and experienced landscape architect and planning firm, to help with the planning process. And we engaged our regional planning agency, NIMCOG, to help determine the capacities of suggested zones. Over the past couple of months, we have reviewed results of the strategic planning retreat and gathered data from our online survey to determine the best options for locating potential housing. Going forward, we plan to begin public hearings in December, and at the same time submit a draft zoning bylaw to the state to confirm compliance, thereby paving the way to presenting our recommendations to annual town meeting in March. With that in mind, I would like to turn over the proceedings to our consultant, Dodson Flinker, who will walk us through the presentation and talk about how the displays that you'll see in the gymnasium.
Thanks, John. Good evening, everybody. I'm Dillon Sussman from Dodson and Flinker. We're pleased to be here with you, and thank you all for coming. With us tonight, we have Peter Flinker, the principal of the firm, Helena Farrell, McCall Malkovich, and Eli Block. So we're going to go through a presentation, and then after the presentation, we're going to do some interactive station activities in the gymnasium across the hall, and all of us will work with you as facilitators of those stations. John covered some of this presentation, so there are a couple of slides in the beginning I'm going to skip through. So tonight, we have the welcome and introductions that John covered. The presentation should be hopefully around 45 minutes long. There's a lot we have to cover to get through the background of what we're doing tonight. And then station activities, which will be about 50 minutes. And then if there's time left over at the end, we'll gather together for a closing. So the objectives tonight are to develop a shared understanding of the MBTA Communities Law and how it applies to Westford, to envision the best possible built results that could be outcomes of zoning changes. So the real question for tonight is, what do you want multifamily housing to do for Westford? Assuming that the town moves forward with zoning changes to comply with state law, what's the best that could happen from that? gather input about which of the potential multifamily districts is most suitable or least harmful, depending on your perspective, and then to identify preferred design characteristics for multifamily housing that we're going to write into design standards for the zoning. So John covered this, where we are in the process. He covered some of this as well, but I'm going to review it again because it's pretty important. So the MBTA Communities Law is a state law. Like all laws, that means you're supposed to comply with the law. It also includes compliance guidelines that were adopted by the state agency, Executive Office of Housing and Livable Communities. It applies to 177 communities. Westford is one of those, and you're designated as an adjacent community because you don't have an MBTA station, but there is one in adjacent communities of Littleton and Acton. To comply with the law, the town needs to adopt at least one zoning district that allows multifamily housing by right. The definition of multifamily housing is a building with 3 or more dwelling units, places for households to live, or 2 or more buildings on a single lot, each of which has 2 or more units on it. So 2 duplexes on a single lot is multifamily housing, or 1 building on a lot with 3 or more units is multifamily housing. And as John said earlier, the minimum gross density that's required by the law is 15 units per acre. So if you have a 1-acre lot, the zoning has to allow up to 15 units, houses on that lot. So the zoning could be allowed by right, or it could be, but it can still require site plan review. So there's some degree of control over design characteristics of the zoning. It can be a base zoning district or an overlay zoning district. An overlay zoning district means that the zoning that's currently in force still remains, and it's an option for property owners to choose to use the multifamily provisions. So adjacent communities must zone for 10% of their current housing units. For you, that means 924 multifamily units minimum, 50 acres minimum. However, if you zone for 15 units per acre for 924 units, it means zoning at a minimum in practice of 61.6 acres. Only developable land counts, so you can't zone all of your wetlands. The state won't accept that. You can't zone your town hall or your schools. You can't zone your open space. And you also, the state has certain lands that excludes from calculations, so you don't have to draw funny zoning boundaries to carve out wetlands and so forth. As John said, the town can require up to 10% affordable housing, but not more than that. And that means affordable for families that make 80% of the median income or less. In Westford, for a family of 4, that's $650,000. The town can't require mixed use, and it can't have age restrictions or other restrictions that make a unit unsuitable for families with children. So a reminder, we're talking about zoning changes. This isn't a mandate that Westford actually build housing. It's not saying the town has to build the housing. It's just saying the town has to change the zoning to enable housing to be built. The town's not required to provide infrastructure to make those projects feasible. Projects have to comply with Wetlands Protection Act and Title V requirements. So in practice in Westford, it's possible or likely that the actual density of something that will be built would be less than 15 units per acre because of environmental constraints and septic wastewater constraints. If you don't comply, there are consequences. Your qualification for state grants goes down or is eliminated for some important programs, including MassWorks, which is the state's main infrastructure funding program. You're also liable for civil enforcement action and liability under federal and state fair housing laws. All right, I'm going to go through some trends in housing and other commercial space use, just to get the sort of the context of what's happening that might be driving land use change in Westford. So as you probably know, you're a fast-growing town. Your growth is outpacing the surrounding areas and also the state. It was about 12% growth between 2010 and 2020. That is expected to continue, albeit at a slightly slower pace of about 8% between 2020 and 2040. This information comes from the UMass Institute for Population Projections, which is the state's official population projection body. Your housing is predominantly single family. It's about 81% of the housing inventory in your town, and a similar number of the units, 86%, are owner occupied. Your prices have gone up, as they have in communities around your region. The median sales price in 2020 was $646,000 for a single family house and $440,000 for a condo. You're now the most expensive community in your region. In terms of your population pyramid, you basically have a lot of sort of children and childbearing year adults, right? So it's like families with children is the main group in your community, and sort of disproportionately compared to other communities in the state. So that said, you do have an older adult population, and that will grow over time as the population of Massachusetts and the country is aging in general. And older adults are generally looking to age in place, meaning in their community, in their houses if possible. But many older adults live in houses that are not well suited to their needs. They may be larger than they need. They may cost more to maintain or be difficult to maintain. And they might also have, bedrooms on the second floor when older adults might need bedrooms on the first floor. So older adults in general are looking for housing options across the state, and I would guess that holds true in Westford as well. At the same time, young adults are having trouble getting into the housing market. When you have a median home price of $646,000, it can be difficult to get in if your income is lower and you haven't saved enough money for a down payment. So both of these populations can, take advantage of multifamily housing, which can be lower cost or more suitable. And when that happens, there's what's called filtering, where somebody moves into a multifamily housing unit, which makes their house become available for another family to move into, and the house that the other family was in becomes available for another family. And so this general increase in the supply benefits people across the sort of income spectrum and across the age spectrum, not just the actual people who are moving into the multifamily unit. And that's the basic idea behind the MBTA Communities Law. The idea is to increase the zoning capacity across a large area of Massachusetts so that you can have more private development-driven housing. So it increases supply and theoretically may keep the price of land down, which decreases, keeps the cost from increasing at the rate it's been increasing. So I think that's the basic idea of the MBTA Communities Law. Looking now at retail, so e-commerce sales, as you know, if you live on a street like mine where Amazon comes 3 or 4 times a day, e-commerce sales have increased dramatically. And as that's happened, brick and mortar sales have decreased. So they went from 93% of sales in 2012 to about 85% in 2020. So over the last 3 years, it looks like the brick and mortar sales are holding steady. They're not declining at the rate they were before. But it appears that in general, the United States has a lot more retail space than it needs. And so for a community like Westford that has a fair amount of retail space on Littleton Road, which is basically the focus of tonight, that has implications for your sort of long-term economic health. The return to office has stalled out. So in 2020, 60% of people worked in the office. Now it's about 31%. That seems to be leveling off, and it doesn't seem like people are jumping back into the office. which means that there's a lot of office space that's sitting vacant. That includes office space in Westford that's sitting vacant. Again, what's the long-term future for that space and for Westford's economy if people don't return to the office? Urban Land Institute, which is a real estate professional organization's trends for 2023, a quote from that says, "We have too much retail space and too many office buildings and not enough residential units or modern industrial space." Another quote, "There's also not enough developable land on which to build all the housing and warehouses where we need." So basically, there's not a strong market for retail space, there's a weak market for office space, and there's a strong market for residential space. We did a survey that some of you may have filled out back in September and early October. There were 362 total respondents to the survey. Most of them were long-term residents of Westford, and generally the demographics of the respondents reflected those of Westford, with the exception of it overrepresenting over adults and completely lacking people under the age of 18, which is typical for these surveys. So the survey found that of the survey respondents, about 53% supported zoning changes for more diverse housing. So in general, it seems like about a half of your community may support zoning changes for addressing the kinds of issues that I was talking about with the demographic changes. The survey results show that there's a mix of hopes and concerns about multifamily housing. In general, I would say people were more concerned than they were hopeful. They're concerned about impacts on traffic, impacts on undeveloped space and schools, and they're hopeful that rezoning for multifamily could result in more housing opportunities. It could provide more options for underutilized properties, the kinds of, vacant office spaces or soon-to-be vacant office spaces. It could increase tax revenue and so forth. And I'm going to just point out some of these survey results as I go through the remainder of the remainder of the presentation. So an early part of this project was to look at the town of Westford and to try to figure out where multifamily housing makes the most sense. So we looked at physical constraints, that's things like steep slopes and areas that flood a lot, areas with wetlands. And this map shows in gray the areas that are subject to those constraints, so the areas with steep slopes and wetlands and so forth. We also looked at regulatory constraints. So the Wetlands Protection Act establishes buffers around wetlands, and the Rivers Protection Act establishes resource areas around rivers. There are open spaces that are protected in perpetuity, and so forth. So this map shows adding those onto the map. The areas that remain in white are the ones that are sort of still seeming viable for multifamily zoning. Adding in the open space and town-owned land, and then adding in parcels that are unlikely to be developed. So that's town-owned land, it's other open spaces that aren't fully protected, and then it's uses like cemeteries and religious uses, MIT land, utility corridors, state and federal lands, and so forth. So as you can see, at this point, there's not that much land that seems suitable for multifamily zoning districts. And then we categorized what was remaining by the size of the parcel. So the red parcels are less than an acre. It's possible to get multifamily housing on those parcels, but they're likely mostly built out as existing single-family houses, and so pretty unlikely to change, and also unlikely to have much of an impact. And the same is true to about the same extent for 1 to 5 acre parcels. And so the white parcels that remain on the map behind me are the ones that are greater than 5 acres. We also mapped activity centers and sidewalks and the Bruce Freeman Trail in your town. And so this map represents, the circles represent basically activity centers in your town, including schools, town hall, libraries, retail, so forth. And what you can see is there's a really strong cluster of activity along Littleton Road. and then some scattered areas to the north of that. So when you overlay those activity centers on the previous map, you can see the areas that seem to be like most suitable in our opinion for multifamily housing. And of those, the Littleton Road corridor really jumps out as the area that has the largest parcels, with meaning the most potential, and also the greatest cluster of activity. We asked in that survey what criteria people thought we should use when evaluating parcels for multifamily or areas for multifamily zoning, and they said that access to public transportation and grocery stores was most important, that multifamily housing should be located on already developed land, and one factor that had risen up earlier in this process, that multifamily housing should be away from existing residential. That came up in an early focus group for the project. Didn't seem to be a priority for the survey respondents. That was ranked pretty low. So those point back towards Littleton Road. You have access to the only public transportation line in your town runs along Littleton Road. There's a grocery store there, and there's already developed land that has potential for redevelopment. So from that, the MCMAC committee, of which John is the chair, identified specific areas along Littleton Road to evaluate further. And one of the key tasks for you all tonight is to say whether you think the town should zone some or all of these areas. And there's the first station when you walk into the gym with Eli is going to be a great opportunity for you to talk about that. How do you make this decision of which areas should be rezoned and which should not be rezoned? Okay, so the first one is Neshoba Valley Ski Area. This property is a little bit misleading in terms of its unit capacity, because most of it is a ski slope and backlands that are used for trails and so forth. So not much of this property is likely to get redeveloped. It's basically the area along the bottom of the ski slope close to the existing parking and access. One step of the process was, after the MCMAC committee identified these areas, they fleshed out some basic dimensional parameters for zoning, things like front and side and rear setbacks and minimum open space coverage, so basic zoning dimensional standards. And then the districts and those standards were checked with what's called the compliance model, which is the tool the state uses to confirm that zoning a town puts forward actually meets the requirements of the law. And the compliance model generates a unit capacity for the district in a very crude way, which likely overestimates the amount of units that could be generated there. So it estimated that the unit capacity in this district would be 2,874 units, which is, I think, very, very high, especially since Neshoba wants to continue to operate the ski slope and to continue to operate outdoor recreation. There's a plan that has been put forth for the Neshoba property. It's shown here, so it shows multifamily housing clustered at the bottom of the slope in two places, and the remainder of the site not touched. The second area is the Powers Road and Robbins Road area. So this is an area that has two multifamily housing projects within it already, the Bell Westford buildings. And then it also has existing office uses and a lot of surface parking, most of which is currently vacant at this point. The third area is called Littleton Road South. So this includes Westford Swim and Tennis, the Westford Regency Inn, the Land Drive area, which is mostly office and then also has a extended stay hotel in the back. and then another office, a couple additional office buildings. And I believe a hardware as well. The next one is called Littleton Road North, so it's across the street from Littleton Road South. I mistakenly said the Westford Regency Inn was in that last one. It's actually in this one. This basically a sandwich between Littleton Road to the south and 495 to the north, and there are a lot of wetlands surrounding what's currently built. So essentially the areas that are currently either built upon or paved are about the extent of what can be developed there because of the existing wetlands. The next area is the Westford Valley Marketplace and Plaza, so that's the, the Whole Foods and lots of other businesses in the strip plazas there. And then there's Technology Park Drive, which is on the far east end of the areas that are being considered. So this is an office park, and it's under a single ownership. The owner of this property is interested in zoning for multifamily housing. And there's also a power line corridor that runs through this area. So we asked in that survey which areas people thought were most suitable, like which of these specific areas people thought were most suitable. Technology Park Drive was rated as being suitable by 60% of the survey respondents. Then there was a cluster of areas that were rated at about 40% people said they were suitable, and that's Robbins Road, Littleton Road North and South, and Neshoba Valley Ski Area. At that time, there was an area called Balsam Circle that was under consideration. It scored very low, and it's been taken off the map now. One of the questions in the surveys was about whether Littleton should zone for the least amount of land to fulfill the law. About 17% of the survey respondents said that Westford should not comply with the law. You should break the law. 36% said that you should rezone only the minimum area that's required by the law, and about 47.5% said that you should rezone a larger area. So this zoning has to pass by 50% at town meeting. Normally zoning requires 2/3. There's a special sort of carve out for this zoning in the state law, and so it only has to pass by 50%. So at this point, it looks like if the survey is representative, which honestly we can't say because it's a convenient sample, right? It's only those who chose to fill out the survey. But if it is accurate, you're sort of on the edge of potentially passing zoning for a larger area. We also asked about design standards. So the zoning can include design standards, and we asked people what topics the design standard should cover. The highest priority that came out was sustainability, and so please talk to us tonight about what that means to you. Walk and bike infrastructure was the next highest topic, and then architectural design came in after that. And we have stations tonight about walking and biking infrastructure, looking at street cross-sections with Helena, and then a station about different types of buildings, looking at photos and saying what you like and don't like about them, and that will be with McCall. Okay, so my portion of the presentation is complete, and now Peter is going to give you some examples of development projects for multifamily housing to get you thinking about what it is you might want in Westford. And hopefully he'll have better luck with the microphone than me. We're going to hold questions until the end of the presentation, and then we'll have time for them.
Right. So Dillon made you eat your vegetables with all that data and technical analysis, and hopefully this is more like dessert. But it's, 170 communities are subject to the law, probably 170 communities. There's a lot of concern about what multifamily housing is going to do to the character of those cities and towns. And part of that is because historically, we only had a few models to go on. It was like the single family house in a beautiful New England town, and then there was the big ugly apartment down by the highway. And for many, many years, there was very little in between. what we're discovering now is that there's a lot of interest in what's called the missing middle, which is duplexes, triplexes, townhouses, all those different kinds of housing types that used to be present in our cities and towns but haven't really been developed recently. And part of that interest is because, as Dillon said, there's a huge demand for smaller units. There's a huge demand for people who want to live within walking distance of an existing town center, go to the library, go to the shopping centers, whatever it might be. And that's really driving the market to turn away from just this sort of single family on a cul-de-sac or a big ugly apartment building and try to think about how can we get back to creating real communities with different types of housing mixed up the way they used to be in pretty much any small town. And the other concern people have is this density. 15 units an acre sounds like a lot if you only have 1 unit on 2 acres or whatever the zoning might be in a lot of towns. But it doesn't have to look like something foreign. This is just a little project in Hingham, 4 dwelling units on a 10,000 square foot lot, but it adds up to 16 units an acre. But it can be designed to fit into a traditional town center. This is another interesting one in Situate, which it's got kind of this old structure up toward the street, and then they put apartment buildings going back away from the street, which are modeled after sort of traditional New England town buildings, but it incorporates a density of 21 units an acre. And then the other nice thing about this is the parking is kind of hidden behind the building, so you don't see that from the street. Here's an apartment, 24 units in Brookline, sort of designed like a big estate building. There's one in Northampton, 31 units on a half an acre, 62 units an acre in density, but it looks appropriate for a town like Northampton. It's sort of a big downtown building. And then, more commonly, we see a lot of developers starting to build buildings that kind of combine the form of a traditional single-family home with the larger mass and what we call footprint of an apartment house. So this is one in Newton, which is pretty common, where it's been divided up into smaller masses with these dormers and the breaks and the facade, which make it feel more like a collection of smaller houses lined up, but in fact it is one large apartment building with parking behind it. Here's another one in Lincoln, which is, I don't know if this is kind of a Swiss chalet sort of architecture, but it's, again, a pretty big boxy building inside, but the outside has been designed and broken up to look more like a collection of smaller structures that just happen to be connected. This is an interesting one, Sea Captain's Row in Hyannis. This is another sort of a downtown example, but it's a series of sort of mid-size buildings with apartments that are stacked up above each other within a single building. So each of these has an apartment on each floor, and each of the wings has one apartment. So each of these buildings is like 6, 8, 9 apartments stacked up above each other. It's kind of the idea of the traditional triple-decker that you saw throughout larger cities in Massachusetts, but redesigned to fit into the sort of the character of Hyannis, and it's been pretty popular there. And part of that is, having entrances that face the street with a cute little porch, a sidewalk that gives direct pedestrian access to the street, and then one of the most important things is from the street, you don't really see the parking. So that's something we'll talk about a lot tonight, is like, where does the parking go? How can we get it out of the way so we enjoy what we like about buildings and don't have to just look at the parked cars? The other thing we want to talk about tonight is how developers are starting to shape the sort of traditional collection of development types to really create new communities, because that's something else that was kind of lost in the last 50 years of development. We built these cul-de-sacs with beautiful houses. We built condominium developments with, attractive swimming pools and so on. Not that there's anything wrong with those things, but what we didn't do is really build a sense of community, a sense of being part of something larger that sort of held everything together. This is a nice example from Norton, which has a little mixed-use building when you come in, and then there's a beautiful town green, and then all of the buildings are lined up on streets, again with parking on alleys in the rear. So you don't see the parked cars. What you do see is beautiful porches, each with a nice little sidewalk entrance. The focus is on the public space of the park, the public space along the streets, and all of the uses are, you might say, sort of subservient to that. So that the community is what holds this thing together rather than just being a collection of houses. And it's, you know, it's pretty big and it's got a lot of units, but on the ground it's beautiful, I think. And you really can't tell it apart from, you know, a 200-year-old village center, and that's because it was intentionally designed according to those same principles, where people on foot are celebrated and cars are allowed and accommodated but not given the sort of the front place. Though I say that, there is parking on the street, but most of the parking is in the back on the alleys. So with care to the design, you can get a fair amount of density in a small place, comply with the MBTA law, but still create something which has a sense of community. Here's another picture of that Red Mill Village, where you see the sort of the central park with the paths, and then there's room for community gardens and so on. And then, you know, the result, the sort of the thing that emerges from this is something we talk about called sense of place, right? It feels like New England, but also over time, it'll feel like its own thing. It'll be, oh yeah, I recognize this is Red Mill Village. I live there, it's wonderful. Here's sort of an opposite example, but also shows what the marketplace is doing. This is in Clifton Park, New York, which, like Westford, that has the New York Thruway running right through it, and they built a lot of shopping malls and shopping plazas along the Thruway. And now they've come up with a plan to try to take this shopping mall area and redesign it and redevelop it to be more of a real downtown. And so this is sort of the before, and then you can see they're just starting by adding some new buildings sort of at the edge of the parking lot along the street. The idea being you start to shape the space along the street, again, as a shared public space where you're looking at a building, whether you think this is attractive enough or not. What you're not looking at is a parking lot. And from the ground level, you start to have, again, some of the traditional features of, you know, an old downtown. So there's on-street parking, there's a wide sidewalk, there's places for trees, which will eventually grow up and shade the sidewalk. And then there's a building which, it's a big apartment building, but it's broken up and it's massing into a number of sort of separate sections, and it has mixed use or retail on the ground floor. So again, it's sort of going back to what would people have built 150 years ago and using that as more of the model. Here's an interesting example from Wayland, which you might have seen. This is an old, I think it's a Raytheon plant that's closed. And what they decided to do is create a new town center sort of next to the existing Wayland Center that accommodates, again, shopping, offices, apartments, and freestanding houses, sort of tied together by sort of traditional road system. So the idea is you come in and you arrive at a real place. There's a park on one side, there's this main street with on-street parking, the buildings are close to the sidewalk, and the parking is in the back. So kind of a simple formula, again, based on, you know, hundreds of downtowns in New England. And it works because once you park your car, you can walk between all these uses, you can go sit in the park. There's residential just in the lower left side there on the edge of the whole development. So it's, you know, it's mixed use, it's walkable, but it also easily accommodates people who are arriving in a car. And on the ground level, you have, you know, all of the detailing and the interest that you're looking for if you're trying to create a place that's going to attract people to visit. And then they put on concerts and festivals and so on to bring people in. Because one of the things which developers are realizing, and landowners of these big complexes, is that they're competing with all of the other opportunities for people to go places and do their shopping or their entertainment on the weekend. And because of you can shop from home and you can get your entertainment at home now, you need a reason to go to these places. So they're really looking at the design and the layout of this new sort of community as something that's going to make people want to come there. And then this is part of the residential complex of that, which is pretty interesting. And then here's an example in Northampton of a new community that was built from scratch on the site of an old state hospital. So they basically tore the state hospital down and built a new community based on traditional town planning principles. So the buildings are fairly close to the street, the parking is behind them or on alleys, and you can walk throughout the whole community from the center down to parks and then out into open space, which surrounds the whole thing. And it's intentionally mixed use. So there's sort of apartments in the center with shops and some of the ground floors. There's townhouses, and then there's single family around the outskirts, and then open space around the whole thing. And the result is something that, again, looks like it could have been there for 100 years, but it was only built, 20 years ago. And so that what we want to talk about tonight as we get into the tables is how can we take the number of units that's required by MBTA and arrange them in a way that really produces this sense of a place you really want to be. Not just something that you have to have that maybe you hide at the edge of town, but something that is an attractive place that maybe it's a new gathering place for people in town. And this is from an article from a few years ago, which is, developers, as I said, are really picking up on this, is how can we bring people to these places? Can you make the suburbs cool again? Because the competition is both the other suburbs that are redeveloping these shopping plazas and office parks, but also, as you know, a lot of our kids have moved to Boston now because that's where the jobs are and that's where the action is on Friday night. So how do you make these suburban centers attractive again? This is one in Northwest Park in Burlington. It's a planned development district where they built a new street on the site of a former office park. And so this is a new street with buildings, again, close to the sidewalk. There's a new Wegmans that kind of serves as the anchor at the end of the street. But it's just you park, it's convenient parking behind the buildings, and then once you get on street level, it's very attractive. This is what it was originally, and then this is how it's changed. And so there's mixed use along the 3rd Avenue itself, and then on adjoining blocks, they're starting to build larger apartments that, again, sort of complement the mixed use. So there's a place to live, a place to work, and then places to play that have been integrated with this. It's very interesting if you get a chance to go down there. And then so from a ground level, again, what all of this adds up to is you're taking the investment that developers used to spend building useless, sort of leftover green spaces on the edge of a parking lot and gathering all of that open space together and putting it in the center of the community with beautiful little parks, landscaped streets, and so on. So it's really a technique where you're making much more efficient use of space, whereas now probably if I was to build under your zoning in the office park, there's a big requirement for separating the uses, for having a lot of parking, for accommodating everything on its own parcel. And what that does is drives the buildings apart and creates these, as I said, these useless open spaces. So part of this idea is to bring the open space together, to make it useful, to bring the buildings together so they're walkable, and to really take advantage of those techniques to create something, again, that's a place where you want to live and work. This is another view of from the apartment side of that new development next to 3rd Avenue. And, they're very modern apartments, and we'll talk more in a few minutes about the style of architecture that you think is appropriate for Westford. But it's something that's, again, basically a large boxy building, which is affordable to build, affordable to rent, but with a little bit of care and attention to detailing, you can make something that, complements the character of the street. This is an interesting example up in Woodbury, a huge complex of developed areas around the Woodbury Mall, and they basically tore down half the mall and rebuilt it, part of it with sort of big box retail, part of it with sort of at the lower end of the slide there, some freestanding retail mixed-use buildings and a large apartment complex. And this is something we're seeing is becoming more and more common. Again, the demand for retail is shrinking. We have so much existing retail that basically half of it is going to be empty. So what do you do with the other half? And in this case, you build some mixed use, you build a big apartment complex. And then one of the things which developers do then is bring in the amenities to make it a place where people actually want to live. And so, you know, the beer garden, the outdoor entertainment zone, etc. And again, this is not a place where maybe anybody in this room is going to want to live and work, but I can tell you, our children and grandchildren would be perfectly happy living in a place like this. What they don't want to live in is a condominium off by itself with no place to gather and no place to meet people. And so the developers and designers are picking up on this demand in the younger generation. How we doing, Dillon? We're exactly on time.
You know, we're going to have about a little less than an hour left together, so you're welcome to ask any of your questions to me or town staff individually, but I do want to make the transition now to the design exercises. Hold up. So, I'm going to show you 2 more slides, or maybe 50 more slides. No. So key questions to think about. What's your vision for multifamily housing development along Littleton Road, which is the area we're looking at? We really want you to think about, you know, not how can we stop this, how can we hide it, but how can we make it as good as it possibly can be? And then we'll see if we can write the zoning to make that possible. So try to have an open mind and be positive. Which of the potential districts should the town move forward with? Okay, and there are 5 stations there. So the first one is about opportunities on Littleton Road. What's the most suitable place for multifamily housing? What other improvements would you want to see if there's going to be multifamily housing and so forth? The second one is modeling the Robbins Road area. You're going to play with little styrofoam pieces to configure housing, and that's with Peter. The third one is looking at modeling Westford swim and tennis. Again, little styrofoam pieces with me. There's a station looking at the design of streets in the public realm with Helena, where you're going to play with 3-dimensional model of a street. And then finally, you're going to stick red and green dots on pictures of multifamily buildings. Red dots for the ones you think are inappropriate for Westford, and green dots for the ones you think are appropriate for Westford. And I implore you to make a choice, appropriate or inappropriate, and stick a dot on every single picture. There are 36 of them. All right, so you can visit all the stations and move at your own pace, and we'll have about 50 minutes for that. At the end, I think we're going to circle up in that room.
All right. Question?